My talk might be a little bit disappointing for you after such an inspiring talk about how the language emerges, because I'm going to discuss with you how language is distracting. And it happens in aphasia, and I will give you 2 lectures today and tomorrow about neuroimaging and aphasia, how we can image the distracting language. And I realized that I need to give you 2 lectures because the title consists of 2 crucial terms. One is aphasia, and we'll talk about aphasia today, more about aphasia. We'll forget for a moment about the technique itself. Just let's assume it helps us to study aphasia. And in the second day tomorrow, we'll discuss neuroimaging and the pitfalls of it when we study aphasia. And yes, I'm coming from a newly opened neurolinguistics laboratory in Moscow, and I also work in Moscow Research Institute of Psychiatry for quite a long time, and we do all our studies on the basis of Moscow Center for Speech Pathology and Neurorehabilitation, which is the largest Russian clinic for patients with aphasia. So this is the outline of my today's talk. As I said, we'll discuss primarily aphasia. I'll give you the definition. We'll discuss the critical words in this definition. Then we'll go to classification, different classifications of aphasia syndromes. This is the major point. We'll discuss functional reorganization in aphasia, and discuss the role of the right and left hemisphere reorganization. I'll give you some interesting, in my view, examples of studies in the field, and to give you a flavor how developing it is at the moment. And I will doubt to give you an exercise in the end, if we have time, I hope. First, aphasia. Aphasia, I like this definition pretty much because it's very compact, although there are many existing. Aphasia is a language disorder due to focal brain injury after language acquisition. And I stressed a few words in this definition. Aphasia is a language disorder. It is not peripheral. So the language system itself, the core of the language system, is destroyed in aphasia. It is not the problem with peripheral articulation. All language modalities are affected in aphasia. To that or those degree, comprehension and production, reading and writing, all language modalities. Aphasia happens due to focal brain injury. So the impairment of the substrate should be focal. It's not dispersed as in some types of dementia, for example, when a major part of the brain is not functioning properly. Aphasia happens due to injury of the brain. So it's not psychogenic in nature, like schizophrenia, for example. We know where the focal injury is itself. And it happens, and this is very critical, after language acquisition, when your language system is fully developed. And this is one of the definitions. Of course, you might know that there is childhood aphasia existing, but this is a total different story. And also aphasia, adult aphasia I'm talking about, is not a language developmental disorder where the language system is not fully established yet. Oops. And at least in Europe and North America, the primary cause of aphasia is stroke, cerebrovascular vascular accident, CVA as it's called. And it might not be the case in some other countries. For example, in some African countries, car accidents are the primary cause of aphasia. But here and in the US, stroke is the cause number 1. And stroke might be of 2 kinds. It might be hemorrhage or infarction. Hemorrhage is when your blood vessel is destroyed and blood flows out. Then,
I'm not sure.
No, we don't have a light. No, okay. But if I can move the. Yeah. So the blood might flow out of here, of the broken vessel wall, and it goes around. And so this part of the brain, the part of the brain which is supplied by this blood, is not functioning properly anymore because it doesn't get the necessary nutrition. But also, the blood goes out and pushes the vessel here, so also the nearby part of the brain doesn't get nutrition. Infarction is the second type of a stroke. It might be due to thrombosis or embolia. Thrombosis is when blood clots are attached to the walls of the blood vessel, and they just stop. At some point, they stop the blood flow. Actually, and the tissue which is behind is dying, simply dying. And it happens already when the blood clots occupy up to 75% of the vessel here. Another cause might be that those blood clots are generated in your heart or a lung, for example, and then the clot breaks free and flows through quite large vessels until it gets to the brain, and here in the brain the vessel net might ends up with very thin vessels, so the clot just blocks the flow. Other causes of aphasia are traumatic brain injury. It is a tricky point because usually we include traumatic brain patients in our samples, but we should always be aware of the fact that traumatic brain injury always causes concomitant disorders, especially memory disorders and some emotional. Tumors are also frequent causes of aphasia because it doesn't matter whether it is a bad or a good tumor. It pushes the brain, so the brain tissue doesn't function properly anymore, and it grows and it occupies the space. So there is no other space in our scalp except for the brain, so the space is very limited. So the tissue takes the space from the brain because it pushes. And infection works in a similar mode. It causes a dysfunction of a particular part of the brain, and if it's not very distributed, the symptoms might resemble very much the stroke symptoms. Okay, so this is how healthy, not really healthy, brain should look like, because it's that. And this is the famous brain you have already seen today. This is the brain of Monsieur Le Borgne. And as Tatiana Chernigovskaya mentioned, the modern techniques allowed us to go into the brain and see where exactly the lesion is. And I should tell you that it's not that Burka thought. It's not only damage to the classical Burka area, but primarily to pretty much to subcortical areas, and which is of very importance is it's the damage to insula. And insula nowadays is known to regulate motor sequencing of speech, and people with damage to insula get apraxia of speech. And this is exactly what Monsieur Tan had. He had apraxia of speech. And honestly speaking, Paul Burka never said that his patient had the classical Burka aphasia. It was not aphasia at all, actually. It was apraxia of speech. And, or it was, we might name it global aphasia, because the only words the patient could say tan. So nothing else. This is global aphasia, you will see later the classification. And if we use modern techniques, modern neuroimaging techniques, we can see the brain from inside. This is how the healthy brain looks. This is like if I cut my head like this. And here's the brain of a patient with a very large lesion. It goes from temporal to, and actually I'm pretty sure it occupies all three major lobes, frontal, temporal, and parietal. And you can see that the ventricles are distorted as well due to the lesion. So symptoms of aphasia. First of all, I would like to differentiate between a symptom and a syndrome. Symptom is a feature that is regarded as indicating a condition of a disease. For example, temperature is a symptom of a flu. Temperature is neither a cause of a flu nor the underlying disorder, never. So symptoms of aphasia are related to systematic impairment of language at different levels, phonological, decoding, and coding. And I'm also talking about comprehension and production. This is why it works in both ways. At the level of phonology, aphasic patients produce phoneme substitutions, omissions, literal paraphasias, so changing the sounds in speech. Actually, literal paraphasia is an umbrella term for both phonemic and phonetic paraphasias. But just this is not critical for the moment. If you want to go deep, you should differentiate between phonemic, if it's within a phoneme or it's more of acoustic nature. But we'll call it literal for a moment. And the phonemes might be also substituted and just omitted. At the level of phonological decoding, patients with aphasia might experience phoneme recognition problems. So they don't differentiate between cat and bat, for example. This is a very straightforward example. At the level of lexical semantics, patients with aphasia demonstrate symptoms of impairment of lexical access and retrieval. For example, they show the so-called word meaning alienation when they say, you tell the patient cat, and when he or she repeats cat, cat, with no understanding what's behind the phonetic shell of the word. At the level of lexical retrieval, they produce a lot of semantic. In some aphasia types, they produce semantic paraphasias. So instead of one word, they produce another. They produce cat instead of dog, for example. These are semantically related paraphasias. They might not be. So they can produce chair instead of cat. Another symptom is at the level of syntax, and this is impairment of syntax processing and syntax structuring in the production. And this is impressive, the so-called impressive and receptive grammatism, when they do not understand properly complex syntactic constructions or do not produce them correctly. And finally, although aphasic patients are not thought to be very prominent pragmatic difficulties, they might, due to other more low-level impairments, they might have problems in discourse comprehension and production. So they cannot grasp the idea of a long text or produce the coherent discourse because they have other problems. But this is this part of aphasia studies is under development now, and our group is working on that hat, but I don't have the answer for you at the moment if discourse is impaired, really impaired in aphasic patients. And I will give you a few examples, and I'll give you also a task. So you will be listening for speech samples of different aphasic patients, and you have just to tell me what you notice, what's wrong with the patient. It might be, yeah.
your recovery. What kinds of things have you done to get better since then?
Generally walking. I had walking, someone let go again, and finally I got it for a clinical shit is good. Just walking again sometimes is bad. Just we'll talk is some I get, some I can't. And I just have to append what I have to get.
All right. Yeah, we'll go by one. So I should say that these speech samples are all from Aphasia Bank. This is a large database where speech samples from different aphasic patients from different languages are stored. And it's, yeah, I have access to it, but I think it's not free. Okay, what have you noticed? Okay. Was the patient fluent? Pretty much. But how much information did you get from him? Yeah, his talk was not very informative. And you might notice also that a very prominent lexical error was that he, a semantic paraphasia, instead of talking, he used walking all the time. And although I know he wanted to express the idea that he has problems with talking, and sometimes he succeeds, sometimes not. Okay, and a question for somebody who's aware of aphasia classification. What kind of aphasia was it?
Maybe vertical.
Exactly. I will give you 3 examples. Can you hear it?
Oh, yes, very darn good. Not good for a long time, but now
Again, step it. I'll try to just.
Yeah. Thank you very much. It might be a problem with the record.
And
yeah, it's better. Thank you.
I'm going to be asking you to do some talking.
Okay.
How do you think your speech is these days?
Now, pretty darn good. Oh, yes, pretty darn good. Not good a long time, but now good because of aphasia. And say, and finally talk. Not talk a long time, but finally talk 7 months talks. And boy, really good, really knows it, yes.
Oh, great. Do you remember when you had your stroke?
Yeah, oh yeah. 5 years stroke, 5 years, stroke, 80, no. Sure, hang on.
Do you remember when you had your
Okay. So what have you noticed now? Please?
Problems with combining linguistic elements.
Exactly. But also he had word retrieval problems. But when he makes a pause, we don't know if it's... Sorry? How do you think they were expressed? Because it's a very specific impairment, and you should use special tests for that. Yeah, but I don't think he made a lot of semantic paraphasias. He just didn't produce words. And we don't know if it because of lexical retrieval or because he couldn't reline words within a sentence. Yes, but and obviously his speech was not fluent. This is true. But what is the amount of information he expressed? What did you get from his very impaired speech?
Well, a lot more than from the first.
Exactly. So the amount, it is surprising. The non-fluent patients with a great lack of linguistic instruments to express their ideas produce much more information than a previously seen fluent speaker. And the last patient.
Sure.
Yeah.
Can you tell me about it?
I really didn't know that at first. Probably about 3 days I didn't do anything. Yeah. My kids. Let me see, how do we do that? First me, was just like this, sleeping, yeah. And then it was okay, but then I don't do anything. I'm like, oh my God, I didn't even think anything. It's terrible. It's terrible. So I had 1, 2, 3 months, no, 3, not 1, 2, 3. Can I do that? No. Sorry.
Okay. By the way, the previous speaker was a Broca patient, of course, as you might guess. And this one. How can you characterize her speech? What's her major problem?
Problems with word naming.
Yeah, word finding problems, correctly. Yeah, and the aphasia is called?
Sensority aphasia.
And we're in the Western classification at the moment. So we've seen Wernicke and Broca aphasic patients, and this is? No, this is the third type. I wouldn't show you 2 times Wernicke's aphasia. This is anomic aphasia. Anomic, yeah. And word finding problems is the major problem, the major impairment in these patients. And you could see that she is trying hard to find the word. And when she fails, she uses the so-called circumlocutions. She describes the word, she goes around it. Okay, these were some examples. And now, to put it in stricter terms, I'll introduce you 2 classifications, 2 major classifications existing in the world. And, yeah, I hope we'll have time to get to the neuroimaging of aphasia. But I find this important for you to introduce. So the Western aphasia classification, it can be described in terms of actually 3 major behavioral measures and some kinds of additional characteristics. And the 3 major measures are fluency of speech, comprehension, and repetition, if they are preserved or impaired. And there are some characteristics. Broca's patients are characterized by non-fluent speech, and their comprehension is relatively good. And I will share with the slides, of course, with you, so you don't need to put everything down. And the repetition is pretty much bad in Broca's patients, and you will see why. So this is, we'll go to the brain level at the moment. And of course, you shouldn't take this story I'm telling you at the moment very seriously, because there are a lot of modern data, not let's say it mildly, not supporting this strict model. But as Tatiana Chernigovskaya mentioned, still the damage to Broca area usually causes Broca's aphasia, and the damage to superior temporal lobe Wernicke's area usually cause Wernicke's aphasia. Although we're collecting now the data about that, it's not that straightforward, but it's in many cases it is the case. So in Broca's aphasia, this is Broca's area, this is Wernicke's area, this is arcuate fasciculus, which was thought the only and the major pathway which connects Wernicke and Broca's areas, but recent data also show that there is an indirect pathway going to the inferior parietal lobe and then here to Wernicke's area, and it is also important for transferring the information between Broca and Wernicke areas. So in Broca's aphasia, Broca area is damaged. This is why Broca's area traditionally is considered to be the motor speech center. So the fluency is none. They are non-fluent patients, but they can comprehend pretty much well. Not when we go to complex syntax, as we know at the moment. But they comprehend pretty well everyday speech, but they cannot repeat because they hear the word or the sentence they have to repeat. They transfer it to Broca's area, and then they cannot produce it. This is why repetition is bad. Then in Wernicke's aphasia, Wernicke center, Wernicke's area is impaired. So their speech is fluent because Broca's area is impaired. Comprehension is bad because of the damage to Wernicke's area, and repetition is bad because there is no input to the pathway to Broca's area. There is nothing to transfer. In anomic aphasia, both sentences are intact. The pathway is intact, but patients have word-finding problems. And actually, anomic aphasia is the most problematic syndrome in the Western aphasia classification because basically they did not find substrate for it. The symptom of word-finding problems occurs in all kinds of aphasia. But for the classification purposes, it is separated into an aphasia type. Conduction aphasia. At the brain level, there is the pathway between Wernicke and Broca's area disconnected. So Broca's area is sped. This is why patients are fluent. Wernicke's area is sped. This is why they can comprehend properly. But they cannot transfer information from Wernicke to Broca's to repeat. And there are the so-called transcortical aphasia types segregated in this classification, and it is a transcortical sensory and transcortical motor, and at the brain level it is modeled as if in transcortical sensory aphasia the Wernicke area is spared, but there is damage around it. This is why when you want to when you want to go from semantic system, for example, to production. So the semantic system, which is supposed to be distributed around and also all around the brain, so people can, the information they hear goes to the Wernicke's area. It is processed acoustically and at the phonemic level, and then it cannot go through. So people perceive but cannot comprehend. And also, this is why comprehension is bad in those patients. Fluency is okay because the frontal lobe is spared, including Broca's area, and repetition is spared because for repetition you don't need to understand what you hear. So it goes directly from Wernicke's area to Broca's, and it is repeated without understanding. And this is the difference between transcortical sensory and Wernicke. in repetition, the differences. Similarly, in transcortical motor aphasia, the Broca's area is isolated from the rest of the frontal lobes. So this is why only fluency is bad. When a patient is required to repeat, information goes from here to here, and it is finally produced. And comprehension is good because the posterior part of the brain is damaged. Fluency is bad. Yeah, and in global aphasia, everything is impaired. This is why we have all minuses here. And this is Monsieur Tantan. And I should also say a few words about Broca's aphasia. You can see how close Broca's area is to the motor strip. This is why patients with Broca aphasia usually do not only have core linguistic impairment, but also more peripheral motor problems with coding motor movements. And this is a picture of speech. And this was Western classification of aphasia. Most of the world uses, but since you're here in Russia, I cannot help introducing you our classification, which, if you read the paper from Ardila, I distributed. Have you read the paper? Okay. Then in this paper I sent you, the author tries to put together, because he was a student of Luria, he tries to put together two classification systems and come to one solution. And we'll discuss the solution a little bit later. So to understand properly Luria's aphasia classification, I need to introduce you a few central terms and ideas of him. He, according to long-standing Russian biological and psychological tradition, Luria regarded function as a functional system, which consisted of, we can model it as a work of many nodes, and the nodes are not exactly the same. They come together to perform a function, and then they are free. And this is, he considered localization as dynamic localization. So this system is very dynamic and changing. And he explained, he thought that this is true, this is where we're now at the moment, and not only we here in Russia, but in the Western world with their aphasia classification, that symptom should be explained by an underlying factor. And this is what we modern neurolinguists are always searching for. We're searching for the underlying factor. We're not fine with just a symptom or syndrome. And aphasia is regarded in Luria's classification as just one of the ways how this factor shows up. So let's go to the concrete things. He introduced several syndromes as aphasia types, but this is more than aphasia. This is about higher cortical functions in general, and aphasia is just one of the manifestations. Two promoter syndromes, post-central syndrome, two temporal syndromes, and temporal parietal occipital TPO zone syndrome. There were others, but these were the major. So going back to the brain, of course, he related a syndrome to the dysfunction of particular parts of the brain. The first type of promoter syndrome, which causes efferent motor aphasia in his terms, is related to the dysfunction of inferior frontal gyrus. This is the Broca area, basically. It is here. Yeah. And he said that the factor, the underlying factor, is disintegrated kinetic melody. This is why the central deficit was kinetic apraxia. And this kinetic apraxia, which is in speech is manifested by impairment of temporal organization of speech movements, causes non-smooth speech, problems with switching between syllables. And we can also understand kinetic apraxia in a broader sense and say that it is manifested also in the impairment of temporal organization of sentences. So words are not combined together properly, they are not organized properly in the temporal sense. This is why they do not realign. And this is called efferent mode aphasia. Another premotor syndrome Luria introduced was related to more prefrontal cortex. It is a little bit to the front from Broca's area, and the factor here is impaired inner programming. It causes the central deficit here is adynamia. So in the speech plane, it's impaired speech initiative, and it causes dynamic aphasia. These patients have problems with inner speech. So they cannot produce speech, not because they cannot realign words, but because their problem is deeper in the speech process. So they do not know, and actually they do not want to talk, and they do not know how they want to talk. This is why I'm discussing the initiative. And it causes dynamic aphasia. So basically, Western Broca's aphasia includes both. Broca's aphasia this term do not differentiate between these two types of impairments. Another syndrome is post-central, and the factor here is impaired kinesthetic organization, not kinetic related to motor, but kinesthetic related to the feedback. So it causes afferent with apraxia. In the speech plane, it means that patients experience problems with identification of oral muscle positions. So, and this is, they try to achieve the right position, and they are always wrong, but sometimes they're approaching, and it is called efferent mode aphasia. It is related to conduction aphasia to some degree in Western classification. Two types of temporal syndromes are related to sensory and acoustic mnestic aphasia. The sensory aphasia, in the sensory aphasia, the major, in the first type of temporal syndrome, the major factor is impaired complex acoustic analysis. I stress that it's not related only to speech. It's complex acoustic analysis in general. Whenever you need to analyze quickly changing features of acoustic signal, then if you have this kind of syndrome, you experience problems. But speech inherently has this type of features. It's quickly changing a row of phonemes, of formants, and we need to catch it. And this is why patients with sensory aphasia cannot do it. So they have problems at the level of phoneme discrimination, but in general, the central deficit is acoustic agnosia. It's not related to speech only. The second type of temporal syndrome is the factor here is increased mutual inhibition of audio traces. And this is a modality-specific disorder. It is about auditory modality all the time. And the central deficit here is acoustic mnestic disorder. So, for example, patients cannot retain a row of 3 or 4 or 5. It's as the length of the row increases, the difficulty increases in those patients. And it causes the so-called acoustic mnestic aphasia. And actually, word retrieval is the major problem in those patients. So to some extent, it is related to anomic aphasia. And the aphasia type and the syndrome, which is not related to anything in Western aphasia classification, is the TPO, temporal parietal occipital syndrome. And the factor here is impaired simultaneous spatial and quasi-spatial synthesis. Here the central deficit is visual spatial processing disorders in direct space, which is around us, but also in symbolic coordinates. For example, and it expresses in language. For example, those patients, and it is related to semantic aphasia, patients with semantic aphasia experience difficulties with understanding constructions like Anne is taller than Bat. Who is taller? They do not know, because we understand those things, let me put it in this plane, imagining the state of affairs in symbolic space. Taller, it means that somebody or something is bigger in one dimension. So we need to imagine it in quasi-spatial coordinates. And if you, at some point, you want to go deeper and want to study this syndrome, you will face with the so-called, how we call them, logical, it's the constructions with, it's the construction where the logic of relations between objects should be understood. And patients with semantic aphasia have problems with those constructions. To sum up, aphasia syndromes have some advantages. They're recognizable, so we can operate with the same terms when in different parts of the world. They allow, to some extent, group studies. So when we want to study larger effects of aphasia, we would love to group patients. And this is the only diagnostic tool and basis for treatment we have at the moment. We cannot require in clinics that in the routine diagnostic and treatment procedures, they will always search for the underlying deficit. It's impossible. So this is what we have at the moment, and in some cases it allows prognosis for patients. You will see later in my examples that some aphasia types are likely to resolve in some others if we go from the acute stage to the chronic one. But of course, aphasia syndromes have disadvantages. Not everyone uses the same definition. It occurs with the Broca's aphasia, as I mentioned, when some people include apraxia of speech in Broca's aphasia, some do not. I do not. And pure types are extremely rare because you saw on the scan of patient brain I showed in the beginning that the lesion occupies a large part of the brain. This is why it's not very focal. Aphasia syndromes are bad because sometimes they're just labels, because in the clinic to diagnose an aphasia type, patients perform some batteries of tests and they get scores, and without knowing what's the underlying deficit, it's sometimes just label, and patients within one syndrome are very, very different, and we're faced with it when we study them. And so no attention to the individual underlying deficit, and so far aphasia syndromes are groups of symptoms because there is no unified theory about language impairment. Unfortunately, this is true at the moment. And a solution could be, as Ardila suggests, we might use large-scale grouping, for example, group patients in fluent and non-fluent, always search for the underlying deficit, and this is why we prefer the so-called case series, not the group studies. So we analyze the data, of course, at the group level, but then we go deeper and analyze every patient separately. Functional reorganization aphasia. So we approach to the major point of my today's talk. It's functional reorganization in aphasia and the role of right versus left reorganization. So after the acute effect of diachesis is when you might get a stroke in a very focal part of the brain, but the connection with other parts of the brain might be disturbed. And because of other medical effects, concatenating medical effects, the effect of diachesis appears, and this is why the aphasia is very severe. It's usually global in the acute phase. But these effects might disappear in a couple of months, and more distant effects may follow. And the effects of brain reorganization. And it is believed that they are, of course, of adaptive nature. The brain, as any other tissue in our organism, try to adapt to damage and to perform to its best the function which is lost. And actually this reorganization, this adaptation might be successful or not. And basically the aim of the research in the field is to find the answer to the question when it is successful and when it is not, and how we can influence it. So functional reorganization is considered to be a major mechanism in recovery in aphasia. Let's look at the scans of those brains. So this is the structural image and the functional, with the functional activity overlaid on top of it. And it is related to one of our tasks. This is action naming, basically, if you want to know. So we found activation in the Broca area, in particular. I'm not discussing this. And what happens if the lesion occurs in the place where in healthy these are healthy participants. In healthy participants, activation was. Where this activation should go and under which circumstances. Another case might be that the lesion is not in the area where activation in healthy in healthy individuals occurs. Does it influence at all? Maybe the activation in this patient will appear in the right Broca's area, and he or she will successfully name actions. Who knows? These are the research questions we're searching for the answers for. So there is still an ongoing debate about the role of right versus left reorganization, and it goes back to 19th or even earlier century when there were several cases documented that documented language improvement after left hemisphere damage with a subsequent loss after right hemisphere damage. So these were children and adult patients unlucky enough to get damage first to the left hemisphere, and then there was language improvement. Nobody knew why, but then another damage to the right hemisphere happened, and they lost their language. And the loss of language was, of course, attributed to redistribution, reorganization of the language to the right hemisphere in those children and patients. And also in the VADA test, when you anesthetize half of the brain with different kinds of barbiturates, sodium amytal, for example, it produces speech arrest when, in some patients, when right hemisphere is anesthetized. Again, it's another stone, another reason to think that language can reorganize to the right hemisphere. What we observe in patients with aphasia actually is very contradictory. So there is a range of authors with very convincing data, and this is actually the data from our lab, which shows that language improvement in aphasia results from right hemisphere recruitment. So in healthy participants, only left hemisphere activation is expected, But to perform the task properly, patients recruited right hemisphere, and it worked. In other patients, and in many other studies, it occurred that language improvement in aphasia results from the recruitment of left hemisphere perilegional areas. And this is what we have in this patient. So here is the lesion. It's a presental gyrus, and when it's needed, but it's damaged, then the nearby cortex works. It fires. We detect neural activation. Sorry, this is fMRI data, of course. This is not neural activation. We observe activation here in perilegional areas. So, but these data are obviously contradicting, and we need to come up with a solution. And it's obvious that proving the participation of one hemisphere to the exclusion of the other is not fruitful anymore, considering the amount of data we have in hand. They're just contradictory. A more appropriate question would be when right hemisphere mechanisms and when left hemisphere mechanisms support recovery of language function. So we need to go deeper into the details. The degree of damage obviously is one of the major factors. So when possible, recruitment of survived perilegional regions support a better recovery. It is documented in a number of studies. And when too much left hemisphere substrate is damaged, then there is nothing in the left. Right hemisphere regions became involved. And small left hemisphere lesions allow optimal language recovery. This is what we can conclude from those studies. Larger lesions cause functionally non-optimal right hemisphere recruitment. This is not always true, but at this point of the development of the field, we might say that in many cases this is true. So this is the combination of degree of damage and severity of aphasia, which influences which hemisphere will be recruited and whether it would be not successful or not. And it is there are quite a lot of contradictory data about the role of right hemisphere recruitment. If it really adds to language recovery, at least to some extent, or it is just a side effect of disinhibition of right hemisphere cortex after left hemisphere damage. We'll discuss that a little bit. So there are people saying that right hemisphere has a positive role, and the right hemisphere areas homologous to the damaged parts of the left hemisphere were found to be recruited in aphasic patients, and it was related to successful behavior. For example, in one study, there was a Wernicke aphasic, and he had damage to left hemisphere, classical damage, left hemisphere Wernicke's area, and he recovered, not fully, but to some extent, from his Wernicke aphasia. And after that, he was put in the scanner, and fMRI data shows that he demonstrated right hemisphere recruitment, exactly the right hemisphere Wernicke area. So the right hemisphere Wernicke area can take over the left homologous part. In another patient who had Broca aphasia and left hemisphere Broca's area damage, it was documented the recruitment of right hemisphere Broca homolog in a successful narrative production task. So both Wernicke and Broca area can take over. On the other hand, these are two very famous studies, and I advise you to read them, which confirm the negative role of right hemisphere. They used transcranial magnetic stimulation to inactivate right hemisphere pars triangularis, which is one of the two parts of Broca's area. And those patients had left hemisphere Broca damage, and the authors had in mind that due to left hemisphere Broca's area damage, right hemisphere homologue is disinhibited. It means that in a healthy individual, left hemisphere Broca's suppresses the activity in the right. And when the left Broca's is damaged in patients, then the right becomes disinhibited, and it is a maladaptive activation. So they inactivated right Broca's. These were 4 patients. They got no other therapy, and 2 months post-onset, with no other therapy, those patients showed language improvement, which I find fantastic. And these are very straightforward data confirming that right structures do not support or even prevent language recovery, but taking into account other data about successful right hemisphere recruitment, and also another study of the same authors, which I find particularly interesting. We cannot state that strictly. So in another study, they inactivated a right hemisphere pars triangularis. As I said, those 2 pars are 2 parts of the Broca's area, and accuracy and speed of naming increased. And they inactivated pars apicularis, and accuracy and speed of naming decreased. So obviously, different right hemisphere structures, even within one area, we find crucial Broca area. So 2 parts of it might play different roles in language recovery. Another important idea introduced in the literature is that a role of right hemisphere recruitment is very task dependent. And that is that if a task involves right hemisphere in healthy individuals, it may be associated with more extensive right hemisphere activation in patients. So it's in healthy participants, the right hemisphere activation might or involvement in a task might not be crucial. It might just accompany. It is a they call it sleeping area, because in patients this part might take over. In healthy it was the secondary part of the whole functional system, but when the crucial parts are gone, then it takes over. And so it depends on the task pretty much, as I mentioned. For example, in semantic comprehension tasks in healthy participants, we very often we observe right hemisphere recruitment. This is why in tasks requiring semantic processing, a right hemisphere recruitment in patients might be successful and fruitful. In contrast to speech production and word generation, for example, when in healthy participants we usually observe only the left hemisphere activation. So linguistic requirements might change the cognitive strategy. Okay, so yeah, this is the idea of this part that the whole bunch of the literature suggests that researchers should focus on exact conditions when each kind of reorganization is functionally successful. And it depends on degree of damage and severity of aphasia. Right hemisphere disinhibition may prevent or help language recovery depending on which exact site of the right hemisphere we're considering. And right hemisphere role might be very dependent on the task. I have a couple of, actually 3 examples of the studies I find pretty much interesting for you to read, and I can send it to you if you want, or you might download it on your own. They highlight different parts of the field. This is a study from Pirani. And they used verbal fluency task, block design. Actually, I will not concentrate a lot at the technical part of neuroimaging or aphasia in these studies, because we'll talk about it tomorrow very extensively. just for a moment, stimuli might be presented in blocks, like 5 or 10 stimuli in row within one block. This is experimental stimulation, and then there is a block of rest, whatever, doing nothing or doing some other task. So this was a block design. Within one block, approximately, they use 30 seconds, I think. Within one block, participants had to produce words starting from one of the 3 letters, CFP. In one type of blocks and another type of blocks, they had to produce either animals or tools. And these were tasks for phonological fluency and semantic fluency correspondingly. 10 healthy people participated and 5 patients. One actually was fully recovered, and 3 had anomic aphasia, 1 was non-fluent, and here I put this table with information about participants because you might find it very interesting. The global aphasic, this is what they had right after stroke, the aphasia type. This is what they had at the moment of examination. This is the time passed between those 2 time points. And a patient with fluent aphasia ended up with complete recovery. Anomic remained anomic. Wernicke became anomic. Global became non-fluent. And again, Wernicke became anomic. Remember what I told you about the prognosis we might get from the classification of aphasias. So if in an acute phase, and if we collect enough data about patients, we might actually make a prognosis about what their initial aphasia will be resolved in some time. Although it's not 100%, of course. So this is what showed healthy controls. Red is the activation in phonological fluency task. This green is semantic fluency task, and yellow is overlap. And we won't discuss all the parts of the brain activated, but you might notice that healthy participants activated left inferior frontal gyrus, Broca's area, together with left dorsolateral prefrontal, which is a little bit higher, in both tasks. And there was activation related specifically to each kind of the task. Phonological fluency also caused activation in right homologue of Broca's area, and semantic fluency task activated middle temporal gyrus and occipital parietal junction, the part which is in between occipital parietal lobes. Yep, green is here. Yep. Okay, what happened in patients? In this paper, I liked that authors wisely divided patients with good and bad recovery. In 3 patients with good recovery, activation involved the left inferior frontal gyrus plus right hemisphere homologue. In particular, when left hemisphere Broca's was damaged, of course, the activation flew into the right hemisphere. And their behavior was successful. In 2 patients with poor recovery, and it's interesting that the left inferior frontal gyrus was spared in both of those patients. So nothing protected them from activating inferior frontal gyrus, we might think. So no extra activation was found, also because they were very poor in their behavior. And when we do not observe behavior, in many cases, there is no extra activation related to the task because nothing happens. They just cannot do the task. We'll talk about it tomorrow more. And the author suggested that extensive lesions those patients had may disconnect the Broca's area from the rest of the language network. This is why they just cannot do anything and there is no extra activations. And this was phonological fluency. In semantic fluency, they observed a different pattern in the second group of the patients. In 3 patients with good recovery, the activation was similar to the phonological fluency task. So, and this is actually also very interesting because in healthy participants, remember, they found that phonological fluency task activates left inferior frontal gyrus and sometimes also right. And semantic fluency task activates more posterior parts of the brain. Here, 3 patients with good recovery, with successful behavior, activated frontal network in both tasks. And the authors think that it may be just because the patients, the successfully recovered patients, adapted a single lexical retrieval strategy which was related to the frontal network. Why? Who knows? And in patients with poor recovery, they found broad activation extending beyond Broca's area and the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex activated in healthy participants, also in the right hemisphere. And the authors suggest that it reflects an effort to perform lexical retrieval on the basis of semantic cue. Obviously, not very successful effort. Okay, yeah, I'll skip it. The second study is about a bilingual aphasia, and actually this is what we're still lacking here in this country, because we're the country of bilinguals, actually, but nobody studies this. Marcus Mainzer wrote a wonderful paper on, it's a single study paper, and this is what you can do in neuroimaging of aphasia, and actually I believe that this is what you should do, because you cannot just collapse different patients' data together because they have all different lesions, and tomorrow I will tell why you might end up with no activation at all. So that was a German-French chronic bilingual patient, quite young, which happens pretty much often, and his global aphasia resolved in a moderate anomic in the German language. They couldn't test the performance on French properly because now it seems ridiculous, but actually not so many years ago, just they write that they didn't have the French battery in hand at the moment. So they only tested German, but the personal impression of the speech therapist was that his French was very, very bad. Maybe it was related to the fact that this patient went through several stages of therapy already, and this therapy was in German, so he recovered in Germany to some extent, but not in French at all. So he was put in very intensive, it is called constraint-induced aphasia therapy, and it was accomplished in German. This is an interesting type of therapy based on communication. So patients are working in group and they're inspired to talk, not to use gestures, and it's very intensive. And pre- and post-therapy scanning was performed. The patient was tested with object naming in German and French. The same pictures were used, just he had to name in different languages, in different blocks. This is another view of fMRI data you might see in the literature. This is so-called the glass brain, when you see all the activation throughout the brain. And only looking at it from different sides, you can see where this activation is. For example, this could be only in one hemisphere, but you see it through. So in pre-therapy scanning, more activation was found in this patient for German than for French naming, in right superior temporal sulcus and right middle temporal gyrus. And these areas were the right hemisphere homologs of the damaged regions in the left hemisphere. So this is what they found before therapy. His German was better than French, and it was related to an extra activation in the right temporal lobe in this patient. And it was attributed, it might be attributed to either spontaneous recovery or long-term therapy effect, because I mentioned that the patient experienced several stages of therapy in German before. The interesting data concerns comparing post-therapy and pre-therapy scanning. So more activation, when we subtract pre-therapy activation from post-therapy activation, more activation was found in frontotemporal areas bilaterally for German. And no difference was found for French. French was not trained, nothing changed. And this was taken as a strong evidence for existing of language-specific effects of short-term intensive treatment. And the authors say that right hemisphere recruitment in this patient, in this particular patient, may be due to remarkably more bilateral language organization in bilingual speakers. It is true, we observed this in healthy bilingual participants.
Okay. Could I ask you what kind of a bilingual he was before the stroke?
Yeah, he was a very balanced. He was a very balanced bilingual. He was born in France. His mother was French, father was German. He was born in France. When he was 3 years old, they moved to Germany. And they spoke both languages all the time in the family. So, yeah. So in this patient, what was treated was recovered. And it also was expressed at the level of brain activation. Yes, this is very important. And another nice paper is from Julius Friedrichsen from South California. I like it not only because he's now a supervisor of my former student, but actually I advise you to read it very much because I'll show you. They scanned 3 patients, one with conduction aphasia, 2 with broca. They used, what they wanted basically was to compare the effects of phonological and semantic therapies on object naming, in an object naming task. And again, they did pre and post therapy scanning. Phonological therapy was just training to name objects with giving phonological cues. The first phoneme, two first phonemes, then rhyme. And in the semantic therapy, they tried to describe the object, to go deeper in its semantic features, and then to name it. So this is what was found in object naming in the first patient, which was with conduction aphasia. Behaviorally, no significant improvement after therapies was observed. After phonological therapy, more activation was found in right thalamus, blue, and it was attributed to increased phonological control and feedback. We're not going to argue it at the moment. I'll tell you why in a second. After semantic therapy, they found more activation in right inferior temporal regions, green here, and they attributed it to episodic memory for the scene pictures. In the second patient with Broca aphasia, improvement and generalization to the non-trained items was observed, which is very good from behavioral point of view. And after both kinds of therapies, more activation was found in superior parietal regions bilaterally. This is here. Due to episodic memory for the pronounced words, and when they subtracted effects of phonological therapy from semantic therapy, they found more activation in superior frontal cortex here due to inhibiting perseverations in this patient. The third patients, actually similar data, improvement after both therapies. It was also Broca aphasic, but generalization only after phonological, and after phonological therapy, more activation was found in superior parietal region bilaterally, Blue, due to episodic memory for the pronounced words. It might seem very patchy to you. It's not about language, right? All those regions are not about language. And this is the idea of the study. They showed that language improvement may not involve regions specialized or predisposed for language, if those exist at all, of course. Instead, regions related to attention, memory, inhibition in both hemispheres might be recruited. And this is very close to the idea of Lurie's school here in Russia, which states that it is all a functional system that might be rebuilt after damage. And the same or new nodes might perform the function that was previously performed by a node which is damaged at the moment. So this study shows that compensatory adaptation involves the whole range of higher cortical function. It's not about language itself. And the exercise is very simple. We made an experiment with action naming. The experimental task is to name, to say in one word what the old lady is doing in a picture. What is she doing? Milking. Great. In one word. The baseline was saying non-word to an abstract picture. This is to subtract the visual processing and also the motor response. And what did we observe in healthy participants? How do you think? It's a very classical task. To say one word. Which area? I wouldn't ask. It's a very simple question. Broca. Broca, first of all. Here. Here we got the activation of the occipital regions, but you might notice the difference in visual complexity, subjective visual complexity. Here we process faces, actions, maybe some kinds of tools, and here is just a vague abstract picture. This is why we got more occipital activation related to visual processing. But the critical thing here is activation in Broca area, and what did we get in patient with left temporal and parietal lesion and Broca's aphasia? It is already strange, right? Because the lesion is in the temporal and parietal lobes, but the patient had Broca's aphasia. It's one of the facts we face every day in the clinic. Okay, I'll tell you. This is what we got. Quite more activation in the around Broca's area, go into also to the premotor cortex, but also activation in the right homologue of Broca's area. And actually, the question to you, this is the exercise, did he show poor or good naming? Taking into account his activation, his extensive activation in both in the left and in the right hemisphere. Just guess.
I guess cool.
You're right. Yeah. Only 28% correct of naming. So this is in line with previous studies showing that extra activation may be related to the lexical retrieval effort, which might not be successful. Yep. And yeah, I think I can skip it. Just a few words that from the papers I showed you, you might judge, and this is correct, that we're still in need of more data and more theory behind a unified theory explaining all our observations. And methodological pitfalls should be taken into account, and this is what we're going to do tomorrow. Thank you very much.
So we're going to have a break then?
Yeah, and you might ask me questions during the break or tonight or whenever.
Yes, Alexander, you have.
The last part of authors use the term plasticity because what it looks like.
It is plasticity.
Yeah, it's all the time about plasticity. I'm not sure they use this word exactly, but it's when we talk about recruitment of different areas, it is adaptation and plasticity, of course.
I have another question. Can you go back to the classification of aphasia, Western classification? Are there any studies comparing anomic aphasia to, let's say, frontotemporal dementia or Alzheimer's disease, because they probably have exactly the same symptoms, word-finding problems, and no focal area of lesion.
Yeah, I mentioned the problem with anomic aphasia. It's like the super term, but it's basically, and everybody understands that nowadays, that it's not a syndrome anymore, it's a symptom. It's anomia, this is a symptom. Yeah, you're right, so it's a symptom which might occur in different kinds of disease.
There are no studies comparing anomic aphasia to...
No, but
There
there should be, of course, yeah. Yeah,
Okay.
I was just never interested. Yep.
And plus the degeneration of neuronal tissues may occur in any place, including Broca's. So you might have Alzheimer or Parkinson,
Yeah.
but it may be placed there. So in a way you get the effect close to aphasia or even aphasia.
Exactly, and this is what happens in frontotemporal dementia. Yeah. This is their symptoms resemble very much aphasia, but it's getting worse and worse. Aphasics are stable.
Or getting better.
Right? At least. Yep.
Is such heavy gesturing, as we have just seen, more characteristic of one type of aphasia against others, or is it rather patient-specific? I mean, reliant upon gestures.
So, you mean the gesturing of the patient?
I saw in the videos, one patient was gesturing, yes, trying to...
I think it's very individual. It wasn't, I'm pretty sure it was rarely or never studied properly, but my experience that it's very individual. And actually the whole discourse they produce is also related to the premorbid state. For example, when we have a project in my lab where we're collecting the pair stories, the famous Chaves pair stories, and Broca's aphasics, and we also collect normative data. And it's not a joke, actually. Many male participants produce discourses which resemble pretty much Broca aphasia, because they're compact. They're compact and very informative. This is what Broca's aphasics do.
What about aphasia in deaf patients? When
It's a very interesting topic.
Gesturing.
Yeah, I'm not a gesture person.
No, I know.
Yeah.
There should be data, of course.
Yeah, but their gesturing is of another nature, of course. Of course, yeah, it's not a gesture.
They have some linguistic system which is not acoustic.
Yeah.
So it's
but it is, the general knowledge is, of course, that their aphasia should resemble the normal aphasia. And
except for visual parts of the brain.
Yeah, this is not my field, but it's very interesting, you're right. Yeah.
So,
Thank you very much.
thank you ever so much.